Me and my friend used to live in a small rented room on the fourth floor of an old building in New York that stood like a lonely sentinel at the edge of the city where the concrete jungle finally gave way to the silence of the woods, and right next to our building began a graveyard so old and overgrown that it looked like a dark forest of stone rather than a resting place for the dead, and our room was the last one on that floor with a window that faced directly onto those graves, which my friend loved because he said it was quiet, but I hated it because every night the fog from the cemetery would roll against our glass like it was trying to get in, and I remember clearly the day he left for his village during the holidays, packing his bag while I sat on the edge of the bed watching the sun set behind the tombstones outside, and he told me not to be scared, just lock the door and sleep early, but he didn't understand that the fear wasn't about burglars, it was about the feeling that the building itself was breathing, and when he closed the door behind him, the silence that rushed into the room was so heavy it felt like pressure in my ears, and I spent the first evening trying to distract myself with music, but the lyrics sounded distorted and the shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch longer than they should have, so I turned off the lights and went to bed pulling the covers up to my chin, telling myself it was just loneliness playing tricks on my mind, but sleep didn't come easily because every time I closed my eyes I could feel the presence of the graveyard outside pressing against the wall, and I must have drifted off around midnight, but I woke up abruptly at exactly 3 a.m. not because of a noise but because the temperature in the room had dropped so sharply I could see my own breath floating in the air like smoke, and I lay there frozen, listening to the silence, waiting for the usual sound of traffic from the main road, but there was nothing, no cars, no sirens, no wind, just an absolute dead silence that felt unnatural for New York City. And then I heard a slow scratching sound coming from the window pane, and my heart stopped because we were on the fourth floor. There was no balcony, no fire escape, nothing that could reach the window except the air itself, and I told myself it was a branch, maybe a tree swaying in the wind, but I knew there were no trees that tall next to the building, only graves, and the scratching continued, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone was using a fingernail to drag across the glass from the outside, and I wanted to ignore it. I wanted to pull the pillow over my head, but the curiosity was stronger than the fear, so I slowly pushed the covers aside and crawled across the floor, keeping my body low so nothing outside could see me through the gap in the curtains, and I reached out with a trembling hand to pull the fabric aside just an inch, and I peeked out into the foggy night, expecting to see nothing but the dark shapes of the tombstones below, but what I saw made my blood turn to ice, because standing on the outer ledge of the fourth floor window was a figure, tall and thin, wearing clothes that looked like they belonged to a century ago, and its face was pressed against the glass, eyes wide and black without any whites, and it wasn't scratching the window, it was tapping on it like it was trying to wake me up. And when our eyes met, the figure stopped tapping and slowly raised a hand to point, not at me but at the bed behind me, and I spun around terrified, expecting to see someone in the room, but the room was empty, and when I looked back at the window the figure was gone, vanished into the fog without a sound, and I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat in the corner with the lights on, holding a knife until the sun came up and burned the fog away, and when my friend returned 2 days later I didn't tell him what happened. I just packed my bags and moved out that same evening, leaving my deposit behind, because I couldn't stay in a room where the dead knew my name. And I still remember the feeling of that cold glass under my fingertips and the way those black eyes looked through me like I was already one of them. And sometimes when I am alone in my new apartment and the clock strikes 3 a.m., I still hear that tapping sound on my window, even though I live on the 10th floor now and there is no graveyard for miles. So I want you to listen to me carefully before you go to sleep tonight. If you live near an old cemetery, or if your room feels too cold suddenly, do not look out the window, do not check the lock, because some things don't need an invitation to come in, they just wait for you to acknowledge them, and once you see them they know you are awake, and they will keep tapping until you let them in. So keep your eyes closed and pretend you are dreaming, because the last thing you want is to know what is standing on the ledge waiting for you to look.